In the early 1990s, two scientists dedicated to exploring the frontiers of science embarked on an intriguing experiment. Dr. Nikolai Kozyrev and Dr. Alexander Trofimov constructed a peculiar metal structure in their laboratory at the Russian Academy of Sciences in Siberia. The primary goal of the experiment was to detect things beyond the sensory limits of human perception. However, what began as an ordinary experiment in this remote northern laboratory soon evolved into something extraordinary, affecting not just the participants, but the entire local population. People reported seeing energy balls in the sky, feeling a sense of dread when approaching the machines, and witnessing the northern lights become dozens of times brighter than usual. These extraordinary phenomena suggested that the claims of Russian genius scientist Nikolai Kozyrev, who inspired the experiment, might be valid. If Kozyrev's claims were true, then the concept of time as we know it would be fundamentally challenged. The video is a bit long but truly cinematic and, more importantly, based on official documents. So, I highly recommend watching it to the end. Nikolai Alexandrovich Kozyrev is a name you probably haven't heard before, but he was a genius often ridiculed by mainstream science both during his lifetime and even today. In the dark and impoverished 1930s of the Soviet Union, young Nikolai worked at the Pulkovo Astronomical Observatory. Recognizing his potential, his mentors and other scientists saw his brilliance as a beacon that could lead the Soviets out of these dark times. However, fate had different plans. Joseph Stalin, the narrow-minded communist leader of the time, saw the light of science and the hope it brought to people as a threat to his regime and ordered the execution of all the scientists at the observatory. An incredible event, isn't it? Out of dozens, only Nikolai Kozyrev's life was spared. However, it wasn't in a rosy manner as you might think. Nikolai was sentenced to 20 years in solitary confinement at the infamous Gulag prison for his anti-communist views. Imagine being the brightest mind of your time and being confined to a cell where you can barely see sunlight. You'd expect this to break all your motivation and faith in humanity and light, right? However, the opposite happened. In this dark pit, Kozyrev devoted himself to science. He recalled and refined everything he had learned up to that day thousands of times in the depths of his mind. Being isolated for years, he developed his theoretical physics theories freely, independent of the scientific developments and rigid dogmas of mainstream science. Meanwhile, his friends on the outside used all their power to lobby and pressure the Stalin regime to release Nikolai, and finally, their efforts paid off. He was released after 10 years of captivity. As you can imagine, the entire Soviet scientific community was overjoyed to have this genius back among them. However, the man who regained his freedom was no longer the same young man who had been imprisoned 10 years earlier. Those who read Kozyrev's claims, developed freely without the guidance of mainstream science, were shocked. Kozyrev, building on the discussions of Albert Einstein and Hermann Minkowski that gravity is not a natural force but a distortion of space-time in the fourth dimension, made the following extraordinary statements. Using a special type of mirror, all forces in nature, including time, could be bent. Time travel could be possible with this mirror. How, you might wonder? According to Kozyrev, time and light were not very different from each other. Just as light is an energy-based phenomenon, time was also an energy. Just as our technology allowed us to see light spectra that our eyes couldn't see and thus increased our perception, the same was true for time. People perceive time as something that flows and disappears. The future does not exist. The past is over, and only the present exists. However, according to Kozyrev, time was actually one large entity, and concepts like past and future did not exist. They all existed simultaneously in the present moment. To help you understand this better, let me give you this example. Think of time as a flowing river, and you are in a boat on it, moving with the current. According to Kozyrev, even though you are moving forward in the river, if you look back, the place you just passed and the river are still there. Kozyrev continues, if we apply a force to the boat moving in this river of time, we can slow it down, speed it up, or even move it against the current. After all, the river of time remains fixed from beginning to end. Only our boat moves on it. Kozyrev stated that he developed this theory using what he called torsion fields in the universe. To summarize briefly, Kozyrev believed that the reason massive objects, as described in Einstein's general theory of relativity, bend the structure of space, causing changes in time and gravity, was not due to subatomic particle energy, but time energy. He claimed that the voids in space, which seemed like empty spaces, were actually filled with a force called ether, which we couldn't see. The concept of ether had been discussed since ancient times as a force that surrounds us all. However, post-19th century science dismissed this idea as nonsense because, according to the science of that era, and this is still true for many things today, anything that science could not detect did not exist for them. What an absurd and egotistical approach, isn't it? According to Kozyrev, just as a bird uses air to fly or a fish uses water to swim, structures and objects in the universe must move within a medium, and he called this ether. For years, everyone considered him crazy until the day we realized that dark matter and dark energy must exist. Today, we know that what we once called the void of space is not actually empty. There isn't even a concept of emptiness in the universe. We have understood that forces like dark matter and dark energy, which interact with everything, exist. Although we haven't detected them with our current technology, we know from analyzing the movements of galaxies that a colossal force is shaping the universe. Kozyrev's only fault was saying this decades before its official discovery and choosing the term ether, found in ancient texts, rather than something like dark energy or quantum foam. Isn't it tragically foolish for mainstream science to consider him crazy? Just as a whale swimming in water creates ripples on the surface, according to Kozyrev, objects like planets and stars moving in the universe create such ripples in the fabric of the universe. If these ripples could be detected or directed correctly, with the premise that time energy is fundamental to everything, it could be possible to see the past or future, and perhaps with advancing technology, even move to those times. Kozyrev's mirror enabled this power. Just as a classical mirror bends or refracts light, the special mirror structure he designed did the same for time. Of course, blinded by ego and rigid thinking, mainstream science laughed at Kozyrev's claims and didn't even deem his design worthy of testing. Throughout history, all geniuses have faced the pressure of such narrow-minded egotists. Lacking financial support from the scientific community, Kozyrev began developing his machine with his limited means and experimented with various metals. He found that the best metal for bending time energy was aluminum shaped into a thin concave mirror. Today, concave mirrors and structures are used to focus light and radio waves in technologies like radio telescopes. The principle remains the same, concentrating visible or invisible energy waves into a specific area. The ancient Greeks even used this method to set things on fire using sunlight, sometimes turning it into a weapon against wooden ships. Inspired by this method, Kozyrev developed the idea of focusing time energy into a single point. With this, the person inside the machine would have the chance to experience both the past and the future simultaneously. Kozyrev designed his machine based on the spiral shapes that follow the Fibonacci sequence found in nature. He created a vertical structure with an aluminum concave mirror spiral. According to Kozyrev's theory, time energy would form a vortex toward the center of this spiral, allowing the subject to see various moments in time simultaneously, as mentioned earlier. Everything was ready for the grand experiment, possibly on the verge of one of the greatest discoveries in human history. But what happened next? In February 1983, Kozyrev suddenly fell ill and passed away within a few days. His autopsy report listed the cause of death as unknown, and the world lost another genius under suspicious circumstances. However, Kozyrev's death did not mark the end of the story. Rather, it was just the beginning. Despite his colleagues laughing at him at the time, there were two groups that took his theories seriously: the KGB and the CIA. During the Cold War, a new front in the battle between America and the Soviet Union emerged: psychic warfare. Both agencies spent millions of dollars training individuals with heightened sensory abilities to use remote viewing techniques for espionage. This brings us back to the experiments conducted by Dr. Trofimov and Dr. Kaznechev mentioned at the beginning of the video. They restarted these experiments with the direct support of the KGB, using the confiscated notes, books, and even designs of the late scientist Nikolai Kozyrev. These events, which would go down in history as the Dixon Experiments, still evoke both excitement and fear in many people today. The results of these experiments were truly unsettling. The KGB and our doctors chose this remote village in the far north of Asia for two reasons. First, the area had few people who could witness these highly secretive experiments. Dr. Trofimov noted the second reason: the region's permafrost contained time energy that had been hidden for thousands of years. As the esteemed Dr. Kozyrev mentioned, just as clay pottery captures the Earth's magnetic records when fired, frozen water traps temporal energy. When it melts, this energy is released and becomes easier to detect. The Dixon experiments were so advanced and speculative that no one had the slightest idea what would happen. And as many later admitted, had they known the outcomes, they would never have conducted them. Let's begin with the first day of the experiment, which the doctors aptly named the Day of Terror.
The three of us entered the psychological research room to work. As soon as we stepped inside, we could feel the emotional tension in the air. We found a picture with 3 points arranged in a circle. One of us suggested placing it inside the Kozyrev mirrors, but we had no idea how difficult that would be.
We couldn't even stand next to the mirrors. The sense of fear we felt was indescribable. It was as if that terror wasn't just an emotion within us, but a presence standing before us. I felt like I could reach out and touch it. None of us had ever experienced such an overwhelming feeling before. I was terrified to approach the mirrors. One of my colleagues decided to place a peace symbol in the mirrors. I noticed his hand shaking like a child's as he reached out. My chest tightened with fear. It felt like jumping into ice-cold water. The fear grew so intense that I had to run out of the room. When I re-entered, I collapsed as if I had been struck. We believe the Kozyrev mirrors were the source of this psychological pressure because the closer we got to them, the more intense the fear and terror became. I felt dizzy and unsteady, my hands shaking and head spinning as I approached. I felt slightly better when I moved away from the mirrors. It was 11 o'clock. During my second attempt, I still couldn't get very close to the mirrors. The fear was unimaginable. I couldn't sleep that night and woke up with a headache the next morning. According to the notes of Dr. Kaznechev and Dr. Trofimov, during these events, the facility's security guard saw moving balls of light in the air. The doctor continued, "When the subjects approached the mirror with the peace symbol for Nikolai Royer, we detected a force field preventing them from proceeding. Subsequently, the facility was engulfed in a plasma-like glow. At that moment, the security guard saw moving balls of light above the facility." This phenomenon repeated 7 times over the following 2 months. To allow the subjects to recover and for the atmosphere of fear to dissipate, the doctors paused the experiments. On December 25th, they began the next phase. This time, the subjects would enter the central compartment of the Kozyrev mirrors and start mental exercises. The subject took their place, and the staff rotated the compartment 1.5 turns clockwise, triggering fascinating events for each subject. Dr. Trofimov described it as follows. All subjects who entered the Kozyrev mirrors reported seeing strange symbols before their eyes, glowing like neon lights. We all saw them and gazed at them in amazement. They were very distinct. The doctors documented these symbols in detail in their books. This phase of the experiment continued for 6 months. And in May 1991, a report was prepared detailing the symbols seen psychically. The drawings on the screen are symbols reported by different subjects at various times during their experiences. Remember, none of the participants knew what the others had seen. They weren't allowed to communicate with each other during the experiment. Despite this, they all saw the same symbols. Let's examine these symbols a bit. You'll immediately recognize the eye symbol seen by all the participants. The famous all-seeing eye symbol. Throughout history, this symbol has been used by secret societies and ancient Egyptians to represent our third eye, our spiritual eye within the brain. The second symbol that caught our attention is the one with 3 dots inside a circle. This symbol was used as a peace symbol by the mystical adventurer Nikolai Royer, who dedicated his life to finding the lands of Agartha and Shambhala. Interestingly, the records indicate that the participants approached the mirrors with this symbol to overcome the fear in the environment. However, the symbol had the opposite effect, increasing the fear and ultimately causing dark clouds to emerge from the spiral structure, as described. Royer mentioned that he initially chose this symbol during his travels in Asia as a representation of the Christian Holy Trinity. However, he later found that this symbol had been used in ancient Asian cultures thousands of years before Christianity. We moved to the year 1997. Over the past 7 years, the The collected 1,200 symbols were listed according to their frequency of repetition and shared with the Russian Academy of Linguistics. Research revealed that 80% of the symbols were also used by ancient civilizations, with one civilization standing out in particular. Dr. Trofimov wrote, "At first, we thought the symbols were a message being sent to us. Later, we realized that most of the symbols we saw belonged to the Sumerian civilization. Many symbols found on tablets were identical to those seen by our participants. I believe we somehow accessed a vast metaphysical information network. The part we encountered was related to the ancient Sumerian civilization. As you know, we think that written history and writing itself began with the Sumerians." I didn't feel anything, but a few minutes later, the moment I closed my eyes, I saw an object flying above me. Then everything went dark. Soon it brightened again. I found myself in a room I had never been in before.
Just as I was about to touch myself, I felt a freezing sensation and woke up. In the Kozyrev field, it felt like waves were hitting my head and ears. At one point, I couldn't feel my feet. Shortly after, a tall man in white clothes slowly turned toward me. Then, some images started to flash before my eyes. It felt as if someone was breathing in my room. But then I realized I was alone and felt relieved.
Participants reported various experiences. According to the statistics published by the doctors, one of the most frequent occurrences among the participants was seeing UFOs, witnessed by 75% of them, and sensing a presence, described by 68% of them. Participants described this presence as a faceless, humanoid figure in white clothing. Dr. Trofimov stated, "When participants stayed in the field voluntarily for longer periods, for example, several hours, they often found themselves observing events particularly from the Roman era, often seeing these events through the eyes of real people who lived them." Besides these metaphysical properties of the machine, the KGB specifically wanted to test if this device could be used for long-distance communication. Therefore, an identical machine was built at the Novosibirsk facility, about 2,000 kilometers away from Dixon, where the main experiment was conducted, and remote communication tests began. The results were shocking. Participants in Dixon were asked to visualize predetermined symbols in their minds and transmit this image to the receiver 2,000 kilometers away. Initially, the success rate of the experiment was around 10%, but when electromagnetic activity in the atmosphere increased due to solar storms, the success rate suddenly rose to 50%. It seemed as if our consciousness and perception were connected to Earth's magnetic balance, just as Nikolai Kozyrev had theorized years earlier. Nikolai claimed that such solar activities created large torsion fields, and that these fields had effects both on the human body and on Earth's natural cycles. With successful two-way communication, it was decided to conduct the experiment on a larger scale. This time, the person at the main station would visualize the symbols being sent into Earth's magnetosphere, and participants in 12 different countries around the world would be asked to sense and draw these symbols. What was the result? When magnetosphere activity was at its peak, success rates reached up to 95%. Of course, this experiment shocked the CIA, which had been secretly monitoring the situation for years. Their reports mentioned that families with a background in shamanic beliefs, especially young girls, were highly prone to this kind of extrasensory perception. Here are some examples to share with you. During the experiment, the person at the main station was asked to visualize and transmit symbol number 63 into the magnetosphere. Participants in other locations were asked to sense and draw this reflection, and this was the result. For symbol number 32, this was the outcome. While these results were intriguing, extraordinary events also began to occur in the region during the experiment period. As mentioned earlier, Dixon is located very close to the North Pole and is known for the aurora phenomenon, commonly referred to as the Northern Lights. The locals are very familiar with this natural event, but on December 27th, something they had never seen before happened. At 12:10 p.m., hundreds of residents reported seeing thousands of arrow-like formations of various colors descending from the atmosphere and concentrating on the facility where the experiments were conducted. At that moment, our doctors were conducting mirror experiments with a local Dixon artist named Kozyrev, and asked him to quickly sketch the images he saw on paper. When the villagers reported the event, all electronic equipment at the facility began to malfunction, but the doctors did not stop the experiment, and it was completed without issues. After this unusual atmospheric event, The facility staff noticed that all objects in the building had become magnetized. The doctors then contacted the nearby geophysical observation station to ask if they knew what caused these events. The observation center reported that the nanotesla level, which refers to atmospheric electromagnetism, had spiked from the normal 60,000 units to 990,000 units, something that could only be caused by a major solar storm. However, none of them could explain the phenomenon described by the villagers, where the aurora lines almost touched the ground and concentrated around the building. During all these events, Kozyrev, who was drawing in the Kozyrev field, had an interesting experience. The artist made 3 sketches during his time in the field. The first was an image of 3 large pyramids emitting light. The second was of a round flying object that he claimed to see descending to Earth from space. The last one depicted 2 black flying objects seen above the Earth. These might seem like simple and meaningless drawings, but a few days later, the UFOs drawn by the artist started to be seen over the facility and the town. Eyewitnesses described the scene as follows. "I saw a bright yellow object resembling a triangle. It slowly changed its shape from a triangle to an oval. During this time, the amount of light it emitted also changed. I saw a bright yellow object shaped like a half circle. Its color was slowly changing. Its brightness was pulsing like a heartbeat. Then it changed its shape from a half circle to a triangular form." After this last event, no more UFO sightings occurred until the end of the experiment, but some interesting changes began to occur in the participants. After the experiments concluded, some participants started to exhibit uncontrolled extrasensory perception. According to reports from the participants, some accidentally gained telepathic abilities, while others experienced the disappearance of chronic ailments they had suffered from for years. One participant reported constantly feeling the sensation of flying in the Kozyrev field and wanted to jump off a balcony, believing they would float in the air. Months after the experiments ended, these side effects slowly began to fade, many of which ended in death. Remember, it wasn't just the KGB. The CIA also closely monitored these experiments and started their own. For those who believe it is scientifically impossible and that mainstream science always knows best, 2023, some open-minded scientists at New York University successfully reflected temporal data using the devices they developed. This groundbreaking theory, known as time reflection, was thus proven in March. Once again, Nikolai Kozyrev was right. Time is not just a linear, abstract concept. It's an energy that can carry data. I understand that this is a very confusing topic, but the potential is incredible. Imagine controlling the energy of time. Diseases, aging, disasters. We could prevent all of them and redefine our understanding of reality. A Marvel movie, Doctor Strange, beautifully illustrated a tool that uses this energy, the Time Stone. Its effect was shown like this. By manipulating the time energy on a new apple, you can revert it to its pre-eaten state. This change only applies to the apple, so even if you've eaten it, it can return to its original form, creating an infinite food renewal cycle. So, why isn't this technology being used everywhere? Why is there no investment in it? If you're asking these questions, you probably don't realize you're part of a slavery system. Think about it. They have set up a system where they control you with the small amount of money they give you each month, constantly individualizing you to destroy your sense of community. Why would they invest in technology that would prove you are part of a universal whole, strengthen your extrasensory perceptions, and spiritually free you? Forget about countries. Individuals who have such experiences wouldn't need the fantasies sold by institutions. When you can experience the grandeur of all creation in your own home, why would you need to kiss the hands and feet of a cleric? The moment you realize these truths, you start breaking free from and dismantling that system, which would mean the end for those who established it. That's why such technology, or anything like it, won't be accessible as long as this system exists. In the description, those who research the topic can learn how to make these mirrors at home with easily obtainable materials. They're not extraordinary devices. My advice is for all of you to experience this if you can, because, as I always say, the path to enlightenment starts with you.